Do you get concerned that like some of the stuff we're relying on in the air, are these assets in trouble?
I think our own internal bureaucracies and inefficiencies to get tech to the warfighter is something that if we don't solve it, it's gonna be a massive problem for us in the future.
They're using cheaper stuff and you can't control the airspace. You have a big problem.
I don't really care what the tool is, as long as we have air superiority. Whatever that technology solution is, like I want the effect. And if the effect is air superiority through drones, then I'm all for it.
This is leading me to my inevitable question. Why are we still putting people in airplanes?
These threats represent an existential threat to our way of life. And if we don't solve this, like it could be game over.
This is Dan Meiji, CEO of Firestorm, and this week on the Drone Wars podcast, we have Josh Cabo Gunderson, a Air Force pilot who's got some really interesting takes on the future of all things manned and unmanned in the air. Josh, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here.
I appreciate you braving the rain to make it over from Las Vegas. Why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself? You got a pretty interesting background.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born and raised in Tampa, Florida. And from the time I was a very young kid, I knew I wanted to fly fast jets. And my family, most of them came over from Cuba back in 1966. So there was really no military or aviation tie to my immediate family, but I kind of knew I wanted to fly jets. And my family was very supportive. I was able to kind of get my way to the Air Force Academy, and then flew F-15s, F-22s, and did a couple deployments in each of those airplanes, and then did the F-22 demonstration team job. So I traveled around the country and the globe with a team of 14 people and 2 Raptor jets, so about $300 million in airplanes. And they just kind of said, hey, go around, spread the Air Force love, do air shows, go talk to schools, talk to kids, inspire them to achieve what they want to achieve in life and use the airplane as a tool. And that was incredibly rewarding. Aside from deploying and actually using the airplane in that capacity, man, the demo job was pretty amazing.
Yeah, tell us more about that.
Yeah. What's crazy is at an air show at MacDill Air Force Base in 1998, I met the F-15 demo pilot at the time, and he was Captain John Screech York. He was kind enough to take a picture with me, and I didn't think anything else of it. And then I was at F-15 school, so I'd gone to the Air Force Academy, competed for a pilot training spot to Shepherd, which is the top tier fighter jet training base, and then got an F-15 out of that program. I went to F-15 school in Oregon, and around the corner, and I see this guy that looks super familiar. And I'm like, I don't know where I can place him, but he looks familiar. And sure enough, it was the same guy that I met at the air show when I was 12 years old. Now he's a lieutenant colonel. I'm a lieutenant in the Air Force, learn how to fly F-15s. And, so it really cemented how impactful just those small interactions are, how much air shows can do in terms of impacting people and setting them up for a trajectory they may not think is possible. And that to me was really powerful. So after having done the F-15 for about 4 years, F-15 or F-22 for about 5-6 years at that point in time, I applied for the demonstration team job and was selected to do that from 2020 to 2022. So based on COVID, I actually did 3 years on that job. And it was kind of wild. The first air show we did was in Singapore, and it was in February of 2020. So
that is crazy.
The world's shutting down, and we land in Singapore at the airport, and I get an email on my work phone that's like, hey, dude, when are you guys going to Singapore? Because this COVID thing seems like it may be pretty legit. And I'm like, well, dude, we just landed in Singapore. Like, oh, great, have a good time.
Yeah.
So we flew 7 air shows or 7 days at the air show there. And what was really wild about that was we actually had the Chinese Air Force there with their like Thunderbird Blue Angel team at the same location doing shows the same time we were there. And the Raptor is just incredible in terms of performance. It's an absolutely miraculous airplane to fly and an absolute blast. And then be able to do that demonstration, show off what the F-22 can do in some limited capacity, right? In front of the Chinese Air Force was super cool.
What do you think of their new airplanes? They've been slowly drip feeding into social media.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the press releases we had with relation to the F-47 and the new airplane that we're producing through Boeing, I think they're probably spot on that they allege it's a 6th-gen airplane, and there are some capabilities that they're obviously growing at a rapid pace, which is something of concern, and we need to think about and counter, whether symmetrically or asymmetrically. But I do think they're producing at a high volume, and you and I both know that at some point technology is great, but at some point it's a numbers game. And if you have overwhelming numbers, that's a factor. So no matter how great our technology is, how superior it is, there is a factor that we need to consider in terms of numbers. And that's where I think they are making significant progress in addition to the tech pieces they're developing.
Yeah. So they can just stamp these things out is what we're kind of hearing, right?
I don't have a super good pulse on their stuff, but from what I understand, they're definitely producing at a higher rate. And I think we look at test programs back in the 60s and 50s when we were producing fighters every couple of years. We were accepting a lot higher risk in that testing evolution because we knew we had a pressure on us to produce and to maintain that superiority in the air domain and across other domains as well. But I think that pressure was important, and our acceptable level of risk and test was higher because we had that pressure. Whereas now, I don't feel we quite have that same level of pressure right now. So we're not accepting as many risks, which means our timelines are slower. And I feel like they probably feel that sense of urgency. So their test is moving quickly, which is good for them.
How do we get back to that kind of level of risk? I mean, you're a perfect example of probably someone who might, maybe when they're younger, now that you have a kid, be willing to take some of these risks though, because your whole life you wanted to fly an airplane, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really do think, to your point, we have to convey the urgency behind it, right? We've lived in a society, in a world, not just the United States, but in the Western world at large. We lived in this world where we have been fortunate enough to live in a blissful peace. Obviously we've had conflicts around the globe. They haven't directly impacted anybody here that lives in the States in a way that World War II did, in a way that, the Cold War did economically, and all the pressures and threats of, for example, the Cuban Missile Crisis, that brought home the actual existential threat that these enemies and these peer adversaries face are brought to the table, and I don't think that the average American understands where we are in the world and the urgency we need to have. I would say the Middle East for 20 plus years, from the air side exclusively, was pretty low intensity conflict. Obviously the ground guys saw a totally different ball game. From the air side, when I'm flying an F-22, I don't feel any sense of meaningful fear that something's going to happen to me or my airplane. I'm there to help support the folks on the ground and make sure that we can get weapons where they need to go to support them, and that they can get home to their families. And that was really important. But personally, in an F-22, I didn't really feel any sense of fear that was overwhelming or what the guys on the ground saw. And as a result, we have delayed a lot of the progress and tests that we needed to make over those 20-year periods to meaningfully advance our technology and keep up to speed and or ahead of any kind of peer adversaries out there. So I think to answer your question, conveying the urgency and the fact that these threats represent existential threat to our way of life. And if we don't solve this, it could be game over. And that's not great, but I don't think people are really keenly aware of how important that is.
Yeah. How much of what we've seen technology wise, it seems like it's exponential increase in the quality of the tech coming out of Iran. And now that, even the Houthis are using some pretty interesting things,
It's democratizing tech, right? We're having this accessibility to tech that is now global. We don't need to have, a lab full of super smart people developing tech. Somebody on their laptop can develop code that solve some meaningful problem or develop some new way to solve a problem that could be really impactful on the warfare side. So I think we can't discount the fact that there are a lot of smart people in the globe, and they have access to a lot of the same information that we do. They may not have the same operational experience, but they have that sense of urgency we talked about earlier, where we don't have that as much. It's just like a startup, right? You have companies like Apple, you have companies that are behemoths. Their sense of urgency to develop and create cutting edge technology because their company either lives or dies based on that. They don't have that urgency that a startup may have. So I think that's an important factor that we need to consider as well.
So this is leading me to my inevitable question, right?
Yeah.
Which is, why are we still putting people in airplanes?
Yeah, and I'm not intimately familiar with the F-47 program or anything that's beyond that point. So I can't say with definitive certainty. And obviously, I'm still in the Air National Guards. I'm still a lieutenant colonel. I still represent the Air Force, and these opinions obviously don't reflect the Air Force's opinions. But I would say there's probably a level of trust that needs to go into automation, drone technology. And I think bridging the gap between where we currently sit and the future of warfare, you gave me the recommendation of White Sun War, which I think is a great book, and it talks about how we integrate humans and technology and drones, et cetera. I think it was a very prescient book that shed light on a lot of like future possibilities. So I think the keeping a pilot in the cockpit, I think, is a way to bridge the gap where we mix in, personnel in airplanes or whatever the vehicles, and we combine them with drones to force multiply. And I think that's kind of what we'll see. There's plenty of open source stuff out there about how we're going to team up, manned fighters with drones. And I think that makes a whole lot of sense because it allows us to get past that trust piece where we still have a person in the loop that's been trained morally, ethically on the laws of conflict. They're not just trying to go for an absolute 1 or 0. I mean, people who aren't involved in the military, I don't think they really appreciate how much time and effort we spend on preserving life.
Yeah.
If we go to conflict, if the elected leaders of our country say, you're off to, this war, I want you to accomplish XYZ objective, we're going to accomplish that. And in an ideal world, we never have that happen. But we know that conflict is inevitable based off a lot of the human factors that are going on. And I want it to be the most lethal, most violent, short duration conflict possible. Because I don't want it to protract out. We're now innocent people are being killed. That's never good for anybody. So how do we make this as lethal as possible? But we still have humans in the loop that take painstaking detail to ensure that we're not harming people that aren't meant to be harmed. And I think when you keep a human in the loop, there is that check and balance of morality, ethical considerations, and factors that we potentially haven't gotten to the point where we can program that into automation.
Drone Wars is recorded from Firestorm's global headquarters in San Diego, California. Each week on the podcast, we bring you cutting-edge insights from unmanned industry leaders. Listen as they share the breakthroughs and technologies they're working on, the hard lessons they've learned, and the bold predictions about what the next 5 to 10 years in unmanned systems and advanced manufacturing have in store for us. Enjoying the show so far? Then be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Now back to the show. Lot to unpack right there, right? So the first part of this is I never served in the military, as you know. I was shocked when I started to learn just how much work goes into every time you want to use a weapon, like with an airstrike, how many people you need the approval of to make that happen, and how civilian casualties are absolutely a part of all of this decision-making calculus. And I don't think the US government or the DoD gets enough credit for how they've built this system that does have to accomplish two things, right? One is get the target, and two, to the greatest extent possible, protect human life while you're doing that. You know what I mean?
100%. I mean, there were nights where we were over Iraq or Syria, and we had the right person, we had the right weapons, we had the right sensors on, we had all this stuff lined up. But let's say it was 7:30 in the morning, and kids are going to school. We're like, well, we're not going to strike then, because we can't afford to hurt somebody that's innocent. So we, despite knowing this guy might be an HVI, high valued individual, we're not going to strike right now. We're going to have restraint because we know that this potentially could lead to an outcome we don't want. And I think that's one of the miraculous things about Western society is that we do consider that on a deep level. You look at Giulio Douhet from back in World War II, he was Italian air marshal, and he was a big proponent of hitting centers of gravity, hitting, civilian areas, right? Because it was going to break the morale of people. And while it's incredibly effective, it is contrary to our moral and ethical beliefs. And I'm super proud of the work that, the people in the military do on a daily basis to ensure that we protect those folks.
Do you agree with that? That's because, if you look at how strategic bombing developed after World War II, right? And I mean, in World War II, even how they systematically went after population centers in Germany and Japan, and then you look at Ukraine, right? Russia throws a lot of stuff at major population centers. It almost is the people are more upset and willing to fight even harder based on that action. I mean, is it counterintuitive, or is it maybe cultural? I don't know. But you look at how airstrikes on civilian, population centers, especially in the Ukrainian war, the folks are even more resilient, it seems than, we're breaking their spirit. I don't know.
I definitely think it's a really nuanced discussion. And I think the I guess where I would look at in terms of asking more questions to kind of understand that problem more would be, what is the technology being used? So when I think about World War II, for example, strategic bombardment was relatively new, right? So imagine you're in a dark room fighting somebody that you can't see and they have nogs on, you're going to be terrified.
Yep.
Because you're like, I don't know where the threat's coming from. I don't know where they're striking. I have no idea what their capabilities are. Now, if you're in a room where lights are on and you're equally matched and whatever else, and they're just fighting you symmetrically, and you're like, okay, I feel like I can put up a fight, there's a sense of hope there. When you think about World War II strategic bombardment, and they had bombers that were like cutting edge, new, and they're hitting you in ways that you didn't think were possible.
Right.
And you obviously had the rockets from Germany hitting, London, and it's like, what is this technology?
Right.
Like, do we have even a chance of winning? And I think in Ukraine, there's a meaningful way to win. And I think people see that. So when faced with an adversary that's striking you, especially population centers, you're like, okay, they're hitting us here, but like, we have a way to fight back.
Right.
You look at World War II and the atomic weapons used in Japan, like that was a complete unknown. A city just went from something to nothing in a fraction of a second, and now you're back in that dark room fighting some guy with nogs, and you're like, I don't know where this is coming from. So I think that's a component as well in terms of how it affects psychologically the population.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating take. Let's go back to the like human in loop discussion for a second here, right? The phrase I'm starting to hear is human on the loop, right? Like where we have to build, like to your said, the ethics into the AI, because of how fast things are going to move. Have the decision tree protect human life, go after the bad guys. But still have like the a finger on the pulse of it. I mean, do you think that's going to be possible? I mean, are our adversaries going to have the same thing? I mean, it's again, another big discussion we're hearing a lot about.
It's a big talking point. And I think that, like every other difficult topic, it depends, right? I don't think they're going to be as willing to account for ethics and morality like we would.
Yeah.
Which is what it is. It's, you look at the Middle East, they surely were not using ethics and morals, at least by Western standards, to fight warfare. And we chose to still, apply those. I do think there wasn't really an existential threat there. So I think the difference there is like if given the option, we're going to pick morality and ethics and preserving human life above all else. If we got to a existential conflict, we're like, fighting for the survival of America and the Western world, like maybe that changes. I don't know.
Sure.
I'm not making any assumptions or assertions that'd be the case, but I do think the threat of survival is a factor. And the human on the loop piece, it once again goes to the scale of conflict. I look at the Middle East as an example, and I also want to make sure I highlight the fact that we as a country, and in most countries out there, we always train for the last war. We always prep for the last war. We don't prep for the next one. And that's a fundamental flaw that we have in terms of our acquisition process, our test process. Like, we are not developing things for the next war. We're developing things based off the previous war. And I look at the F-22 as a great example where, the F-22 and the YF-23, and I don't know anything about the YF-23, but just looking at the airplane, looking at the size, the capacity, all that stuff, and the shape of it, like maybe that would have been a better platform for what we need now. But we picked the F-22 because it was a very maneuverable, like it's probably the most maneuverable jet we'll ever produce, in my opinion. I have no idea about the F-47. I have no idea like what it's going to do in terms of performance and maneuverability, but I will say the F-22 is pretty remarkable. I also want to highlight the Middle East as an example of saying we have combined air operations centers, so CAOCs, that are around the world, and that's where we coordinate Air Force and really air assets with Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, partner nations, whoever it is. And oftentimes you'd have like a colonel, you have a high-ranking leadership person in the CAOC making decisions at the tactical level. So in a large-scale conflict, I think that's somewhat negative habituation and negative training for us, because we have to have somebody that's higher-ranking involved in the decision-making at the tactical level. You're like, well, that's not good. What if we're in a large-scale conflict and I don't have time to ask for your permission? I need to go empower the guys and the girls doing the job to take action and either employ weapons, not employ weapons, have their judgment based on their training. I mean, shoot, when I stopped flying jets full-time, I would say I probably had over $100 million of training invested in me in terms of all the time and hours and all that stuff. And it's like, if we're spending that much money and time and training on these people, like empower them to do their job. because in a large scale conflict, we don't have the time, we don't have the luxury of time to have all this oversight. So I think that'll be a hurdle for us to overcome after 20 years of habituating the same thing in the Middle East. How do we empower folks to take action when they need to in a peer-on-peer kind of adversary fight?
What's interesting is like I had an off-the-record discussion with some folks who are doing kind of, we'll call it AI arms control in Europe. And what they're recommending now, okay, is you got to have guardrails of how we employ it, but then you also got to have the button to just turn it off.
Yeah.
Where if somebody like yourself, say you're flying a jet and you got 6 drones supporting you, right?
Which would be rad.
Which would be really rad.
What I want to say, for the record, be rad.
Yeah, we need to get there sooner rather than later, right? But they need to be, that's basically the framework they're recommending, okay? And it's not official yet, but that was like what they're saying is like, we have to assume that people at the lowest level are trained to say when we like turn it on.
Yep.
And turn the guardrails off, right? Because if the bad guys have no guardrails and you want to kind of maintain the ethics and values you have, at a certain point, maybe you also have to fight without a guardrails, which is, hey, everything in this kill box is now an enemy and we gave them a warning, let it rip,
Yeah, and that's, great point in terms of geofencing areas, right? We have the capacity to do that. And like you mentioned, kill boxes as an example, I've never seen happier fighter pilots than when they were given type 3 control on convoys in the kill box. And you're just like, they just had a great time, right? And because the guardrails in that example are off. And I do think that we have the ability to still give it parameters in terms of automation and geofence things to say, hey, in these confines, like, have at it, do your thing, so having the ability to turn on, turn off, I think is important. It's then becomes a question of like, when does it become sentient? When does it realize
totally, man?
Well, if I don't do XYZ task, then I'm going to lose the game, right? Because it's a 1 and 0 at that point, like if I don't do this, I'm going to lose. And I'm not willing to lose because you told me not to lose.
I mean, and that's kind of the criticism for the AI they used in Gaza is they're like, we're going to have this targeting software, right? And all of a sudden, every single building became a target, And so, like, is that an example of like it going too far? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I'm not entirely familiar with what they use and how they process things, but I would say if the AI is causing conflict or harm to folks that are innocent, like it's gone too far, And I'm incredibly thankful for all the people that are working diligently to provide some semblance of humanity into AI. It's an amazing tool. I don't know how many people on percentage wise use AI tools this day and age. I'm sure it's a fair amount, but I'm sure it's going to exponentially grow. So the folks that are working hard to incorporate humanity into it and give it guardrails, like, God bless them, because we need it for sure.
Totally.
Thanks for listening to the Drone Wars podcast. Each week, we bring you fascinating conversations with leaders shaping the future of air, sea, land, and space technologies. Catch new episodes wherever podcasts can be found. Until then, we'll see you next time.